July 20th, 1969. A voice cuts through the static in mission control.
4 forward, drift into the right a little. Ready? Down a half. 30 seconds forward.
To most of the world, Armstrong was seconds away from running out of fuel. 600 million people held their breath. That's nearly 1 in 5 humans alive at the time. More people than had ever watched a single event in history. Was Apollo 11 about to succeed or about to fail at the very last moment? History books call it one of the closest calls in spaceflight. But what really happened in those final moments? Was Armstrong actually seconds from crashing Eagle, the lunar module, into the moon? Or was there more to the story? A hidden rule, a quiet margin, and a commander willing to bend both? Imagine the alternative. No footprints in lunar dust, no American flag planted, no one small step for man. July 20th, 1969 could have been remembered not as triumph, but as retreat. The truth behind those final 30 seconds is far more fascinating than the myth. To understand why, we need to step inside the cockpit of the lunar module and relive the most dangerous landing in history. But the truth isn't what most people think. Because Armstrong wasn't just fighting the clock, he was fighting the rules themselves. Why was Apollo 11 so important? Why did this single mission matter so much, not just for NASA, but for America and for the world? To answer that, we have to rewind, not just to Kennedy's promise, not just to the Cold War rivalry with the Soviets, but to 3 men who carried all of it on their shoulders. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise that sounded almost impossible.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. But this was more than exploration. It was a battle of prestige. The Soviets had already shocked the world with Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite. And in April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to fly in space, orbiting the Earth before any American astronaut. To many Americans, it felt like waking up to find their rival's flag flying over their own front yard. The moon became the ultimate prize. Whoever reached it first would prove not just technological strength, but national destiny. By 1969, after billions spent and 400,000 workers laboring on rockets, modules, and systems, was crushing. The question wasn't only whether America would win, it was whether 3 men, ordinary in age, extraordinary in courage, could survive the attempt. People often ask, how old were the Apollo 11 astronauts? The answer is striking. Neil Armstrong, 38 years old, the commander. Calm, analytical, almost unnervingly steady. Armstrong had been a Navy aviator, a test pilot, a man who had stared down disaster before and never flinched. Now, at just 38, he would face a challenge unlike any in history, guiding a fragile machine to a world no human had ever touched. Buzz Aldrin, 39 years old, the lunar module pilot, intense, brilliant, precise. A West Point graduate and MIT PhD, Aldrin was known as Dr. Rendezvous for his groundbreaking work on orbital docking, the skill that made the moon landing possible. At 39, he carried both the weight of science and the pride of proving himself worthy of history. Michael Collins, 38 years old, the command module pilot, quiet, steady, often overlooked. Collins would remain in orbit, circling the moon alone while his crewmates descended. At 38, he knew that if Eagle failed to return, he would face the loneliest journey in history, flying home to Earth without his friends. 3 men, none of them superheroes, none of them older than 40. They were fathers, husbands, sons, men who looked like the neighbors you might pass on the street, and yet they carried humanity's greatest gamble into the unknown. Armstrong later admitted the odds of success weren't certain. Behind the calm broadcasts and the iconic photographs was the knowledge that failure was always possible. So why was Apollo 11 important? Because it wasn't just a space flight, it was a statement that 3 men, barely older than the average American father in 1969, could ride a tower of fire into the void, risk everything, and prove Kennedy's impossible promise true. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Apollo 11 failed, the Soviets would claim victory, America's pride would collapse, and the dream of spaceflight might have ended. But if Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins succeeded, they would show that courage, willpower, and human ingenuity could make the impossible real. That's why Apollo 11 mattered. That's why it changed America. Because at its heart, it wasn't about rockets. It was about three men, Neil, Buzz, and Michael, carrying the hopes of the world on their shoulders. And yet, the rocket itself became part of the legend. The Saturn V was unlike anything ever built. 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, weighing over 6 million pounds. Its 5 F-1 engines unleashed 7.5 million pounds of thrust, still the most powerful rocket stage ever flown successfully. Each second, the first stage burned through 12 tons of fuel. It could lift Apollo 11 from the pad to Earth orbit in just 11 minutes. More than 3 million parts, all of them working with near-flawless precision. Even today, no rocket has ever surpassed its combination of size, payload, and reliability. And as the Saturn V thundered into the sky, the question wasn't just whether America could reach the moon, it was whether three men in their 30s would ever see their families again. July 16, 1969. The morning sky over Florida trembled as a machine unlike any other prepared for ignition. This was the Apollo 11 launch, the moment America's greatest gamble would leave Earth. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the engines lit. The ground shook with the power of an earthquake, and in that instant, humanity's journey to the moon began. The Apollo 11 rocket wasn't just a vehicle. It was the largest, most powerful machine ever built by human hands. Known as the Saturn V, it stood 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. Its weight? More than 6 million pounds. Its thrust? 7.5 million pounds of force at liftoff. The power of 160 million cars, all firing at once. The Saturn V had 3 stages, each designed to do one job, before being discarded. In just 11 minutes, it could take Apollo 11 from the ground in Florida into Earth orbit. Inside that rocket were 3 men, the Apollo 11 astronauts, strapped into the Apollo 11 command module. Columbia Neil Armstrong, 38 years old. The commander, calm, disciplined, destined to become the first man to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, 39, the lunar module pilot, brilliant, precise, deeply focused on the science of the mission. Michael Collins, 38, the command module pilot, the quiet professional who would orbit the moon alone in Columbia, while his crewmates went to the surface. When people ask, how old were the Apollo 11 astronauts? The answer is striking. They were young men by today's standards, barely pushing 40, old enough to have the experience of test pilots and engineers, but young enough to take on risks that others might have refused. How long did Apollo 11 take to reach the moon? The journey lasted about 76 hours, just over 3 days. After the Apollo 11 launch, the spacecraft entered low Earth orbit. Then the Saturn V's third stage fired again, accelerating it to 24,000 miles per hour. That's faster than a rifle bullet, fast enough to cross the United States, coast to coast, in 10 minutes. The trip wasn't a straight line. It was a carefully calculated curve. Along the way, the astronauts performed small course corrections to stay on track. Inside Columbia, Michael Collins monitored systems, while Armstrong and Aldrin inspected the lunar module, Eagle. The lunar module looked fragile compared to the sleek command module. Thin metal walls, spindly legs. It was designed only for the vacuum of space. It wasn't meant to be pretty. It was meant to land on the moon, and nothing else. As Apollo 11 approached, the moon grew from a silver coin in the sky into a vast, cratered world. Think about the curiosity. You've traveled 240,000 miles, farther than any human had ever gone. And now, hanging below you, is a world no one has ever touched. The moon was no longer a distant light. It was a place, and it was up to 3 men in a fragile spacecraft to make history. Apollo 11 had traveled more than 200,000 miles without incident. But now, as the lunar module Eagle prepared to separate from the command module, the real danger began. Landing on the moon would be unlike anything NASA had ever attempted, and when fuel started running low, that's when history would hang on just 30 seconds. And almost immediately after the descent began, Alarms lit up, numbers flashed across the guidance computer, and for a moment, no one at Mission Control knew if Eagle could still land at all. July 20th, 1969. After 3 days in space, Apollo 11 was in lunar orbit. Now came the most dangerous part, the descent. The lunar module, Eagle, carrying Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, separated from the command module, Columbia. Michael Collins remained in orbit, watching his crewmates drift away toward the surface. If Eagle failed to land, or couldn't take off again, Collins would return to Earth alone. At 102 hours into the mission, Eagle's descent engine fired. Suddenly, alarms flashed. 12:01, 12:02. For a few tense seconds, no one knew what they meant. Had the computer just failed? In reality, the alarms were warning that the guidance computer was too busy. It had more information than it could handle. A radar was still running in the background, sending in extra data the computer didn't really need. The good news? The computer was smart enough to ignore the unimportant stuff and keep focusing on the landing. After a pause that felt like forever, Guidance Officer Steve Bales in Houston gave the word, "Go." The descent continued. Looking out the window, Armstrong saw danger ahead. Eagle's computer was steering them into a crater, littered with boulders. He had no choice but to take manual control. The commander gripped the hand controller and steered Eagle forward, searching for a flat patch of ground. Every second he hovered burned fuel. 60 seconds. Inside Mission Control, sweat dripped from brows. To the public, it sounded like a countdown to empty tanks. But to Armstrong, it meant something else. Eagle was approaching bingo fuel. Bingo fuel wasn't the end of the tank. It was NASA's rule. If Eagle was still in the air when bingo fuel arrived, Armstrong would have to abort, firing the ascent engine, leaving the descent stage behind and rejoining Collins in orbit. 30 seconds later, the second call came. 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
The tension was unbearable. The lunar module vibrated, its alarms echoing in the astronauts' headsets. Dust began to swirl below them, rising like smoke and obscuring Armstrong's view. Now the landing wasn't just about fuel, it was about rules, risk, and Armstrong's nerve. Armstrong later admitted he believed Eagle could survive dropping the last 40 feet if the tanks went dry. So even if the rules said abort, he might have pressed on. And in fact, Eagle still had a little margin left, perhaps a minute of hover fuel at low thrust. But Armstrong couldn't know for sure. With dust clouding the ground and seconds ticking away, Armstrong guided Eagle down. At 102 hours, 45 minutes, and 40 seconds into the mission, Armstrong's calm voice broke the silence. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Mission Control erupted. Engineers who had been holding their breath cheered and hugged. The first moon landing was real. So, was Apollo 11 really down to its last 30 seconds of fuel? In one sense, yes. Armstrong was seconds away from a forced abort. In another sense, no. Eagle still had fuel left, and a commander willing to ride the edge. That's why the story endures. The moon landing wasn't just a miracle. It was the razor's edge between failure and triumph, balanced on the judgment of one man. But the landing was only half the battle, because stepping outside Eagle and walking into the unknown would bring dangers no astronaut had ever faced. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. At that moment, 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969, the world exhaled. The moon landing date had arrived, after decades of dreaming, billions of dollars, and one of the riskiest space flights ever attempted. Apollo 11 was on the lunar surface. In Mission Control, engineers cheered, some quietly wiping away tears. On television, an estimated 600 million people, the largest audience in history at the time, watched in awe. But the landing was only half the mission. The real test still lay ahead, getting out of the spacecraft and walking on the moon. Inside the lunar module, Eagle, Armstrong, and Aldrin powered down systems and began suiting up. The cabin was cramped, no larger than the inside of a small car. And yet from this tiny space, two men were about to step into the endless expanse of another world. Michael Collins, orbiting above in the command module Columbia, was alone, the most isolated human in history. At times, when Columbia passed behind the moon, Collins was completely cut off. No radio, no mission control. In those minutes, he was the loneliest man alive. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, after hours of preparation, Neil Armstrong opened Eagle's hatch and climbed down the ladder. The world held its breath. Cameras mounted on the lunar module transmitted ghostly black and white images back to Earth, and then Armstrong stepped off the footpad and onto the lunar surface. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. With those words, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined him. He described the surface as magnificent desolation, a haunting mix of beauty and emptiness. Together, the two men bounced lightly across the lunar surface, planting their boots into untouched dust. They planted the American flag. The pole had a horizontal bar at the top to hold the fabric out, since there's no wind on the moon. It made the flag look like it was waving, even though it wasn't. But planting the flag was harder than expected. The lunar soil was tough, like packed gravel, and the pole only went in a few inches. Still, the image of two Apollo 11 astronauts saluting the flag became one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. For America, the sight wasn't just patriotic. It symbolized victory in the Cold War. This was the moment that changed America, proving Kennedy's promise could be fulfilled. Though the flag symbolized American triumph, Armstrong and Aldrin also left behind a plaque. It read, "We came in peace for all mankind." For 2.5 hours, the astronauts explored, conducted experiments, and collected samples. Then it was time to climb back inside. But their time on the moon was shorter than most people realize. How long was Apollo 11 actually on the surface? And what did they accomplish before the terrifying risk of takeoff? Because if the ascent engine failed to ignite, Armstrong and Aldrin would never leave the moon. Michael Collins would fly home alone, and Apollo 11 would be remembered as a tomb. How long was Apollo 11 actually on the moon? The answer might surprise you. The lunar module, Eagle, touched down at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969. Armstrong and Aldrin stayed on the surface for 21 hours and 36 minutes. Not even a full day. But outside the cabin, their historic moonwalk lasted just 2 hours and 31 minutes. That's less than the length of a single workday, and yet it defined a century. During that brief time, they deployed a seismometer to measure moonquakes. They set up a solar wind collector to trap particles from the sun. They collected 47 pounds of lunar rock and soil, samples scientists still study today, and they photographed the barren landscape. For history, Aldrin described it as magnificent desolation, a world both breathtaking and eerily empty. But even as they worked, a terrifying thought hung over them. What if the ascent engine didn't fire? There was no backup. If it failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded forever. Collins, waiting in the command module, Columbia, would have to return home alone. Behind the triumph was always the shadow of risk. Every footprint pressed into lunar dust reminded the world of the true purpose of Apollo 11, to prove humanity could reach beyond Earth and survive the impossible. After less than a day, it was time to leave. The Eagle's ascent engine would have to fire perfectly, or history's greatest triumph would end in tragedy. On July 21st, after less than a day on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into the lunar module, Eagle. At 1:54 p.m. Eastern Time, the ascent engine fired. There was no backup plan. But the engine lit, carrying them off the surface and into lunar orbit. Above, Michael Collins had been circling the moon alone in the command module, Columbia. At one point, when Columbia passed behind the moon, Collins was more alone than any human in history. No one, not even mission control, could hear him. Now, as Eagle rose to meet him, the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts were reunited. 3 days later, on July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Navy divers swam to the capsule, and the astronauts were brought aboard the USS Hornet. But their mission wasn't over just yet. Fearing so-called moon germs, NASA placed them in quarantine for 21 days. Only then were they released to the world as heroes. In the end, Apollo 11 is remembered as flawless, but behind the triumph was a razor's edge. 30 seconds. It wasn't a countdown to empty tanks. It was a line in the sand, the moment when rules, engineering, and instinct collided. Armstrong could have aborted. He could have turned back, but he pressed on. Had he not? July 20th, 1969 might be remembered not as the day mankind first set foot on the moon, but as the mission that almost made it. Instead, Apollo 11 became a symbol of courage, vision, and possibility. Those 30 seconds defined it. That's why Apollo 11 was so important. It changed America. It proved Kennedy's promise true, and it inspired the world. It showed that even in the face of risk, humanity could leap beyond Earth. 50 years later, those final 30 seconds still remind us what it means to risk everything and win. If you found this story as gripping as those 30 seconds, stay with us, subscribe, and join me for the next leap.